he, like so many of the Russian leadership, is in his 70s. And the interesting thing is we never hear about any of them being ill. Now, unless it's the healthiest collection of 70-year-olds you've ever come across, it's clear that some will be ill from time to time. I suspect this is something that the Russian press is told not to report because it would draw attention to the potential health issues of a certain 73-year-old Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Hello, welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and today we're catching up with Professor Mark Galeotti. Mark is a former advisor to the Foreign Office on Russian foreign and security policy. He's a regular writer for the Sunday Times and author of several books, one of which, We Need to Talk About Putin, has just been updated. Mark, good to see you on Frontline. Thanks for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
Let's talk about the US and Russia 28-point plan that Axios has reported that they've been discussing at the end of October. Senior Pentagon officials are also meeting or due to meet President Zelensky today. That's Thursday we're speaking, to try and bring an end to the war. The details filtering out. What do you make of it? Because it's apparently, if it's all true, the details would involve giving up the Donbass, halving the Ukrainian army, reducing weapons. No wonder the Russians are happy.
Yeah, I mean, Two points really to be made. I mean, one of them is we still have to be cautious because we're very much at the level still of anonymous administration sources claiming. And in the past, we've seen this being used as a tactic. You know, there's a constant struggle within the administration between those people who we might say are the most supportive of Ukraine and those who, I wouldn't say are supportive of Russia, but just basically want America to be out of this war. And sometimes we see leaks being used to spike the guns of the let's make a deal now sort of camp. So, you know, we have to be cautious. And the second point is, look, we really have to stress that this is just the deal that America would seek to impose on Ukraine. Ukraine still gets, I wouldn't say a vote, but it gets a veto. And as things stand, I must admit, I would be amazed if this looked like a deal that Zelensky could possibly accept. I mean, so I think, you know, at the moment, in some ways, this looks to me a little bit more like Donald Trump's escape route, so that he can basically say, I brought together this amazingly great deal. The Ukrainians wouldn't accept it. So there's nothing more I can do. You know, it gives him the alibi to walk away and essentially say this is now for the Europeans to deal with.
Because if those details are true, and you're absolutely right that we don't know at this point in time what they are that's being proposed. It just seems like we're on a merry-go-round with the same things coming back from the Russians each time. It just seems that the more it's put on the table over and over again with the hope that perhaps one day President Zelensky will agree to it, which we know he won't.
Well, remember, at the moment, Zelensky is actually unusually weak in that he's mired in this corruption scandal that I think we're going to be talking about later. So I think maybe part of the calculation is that Zelensky won't have quite the same capacity to say no. But then again, this is the man famous for his, I need ammunition, not a ride aphorism at the beginning of the war. So I think this is not someone who folds easily. But yeah, remember, in part, this is because of the Russian style of negotiation. You know, we're used to a more Western style whereby, you know, you make a little concession, I make a little concession, and we slowly baby step our way to some kind of a deal in the center. The Russians tend precisely to be very hard-nosed. They put forward an excessive, almost embarrassingly extensive range of demands, presenting all of them as absolute necessities, the irreducible minimum. But then at the very 11th hour and 59th minute, then they might, if need be, make some kind of steps down, trumpeting this as a huge concession. So there is still the scope that something would shift. But yeah, up to now, the Russians have very much been pushing this line that, look, we can make a deal now, or we can just carry on fighting and win militarily. Your call.
So am I right in thinking then that it's only the Russians so far who've actually made any comment about this, and we're still yet to hear what the US has to say about it?
The Russians also have been fairly cautious. We've had some talk from Kirill Dmitriev, who's Putin's envoy to these discussions. But I mean, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's presidential spokesman, has been basically no commenting. And I was looking at the Russian press this morning, and there certainly was none of the kind of triumphalism you'd expect. It's being played very cautiously there as well, suggesting, A, that there hasn't been some kind of official line out from the Kremlin to the media saying this is how you ought to adopt, and what kind of line you need to adopt, but also that they themselves are not quite sure what to make of it. They're happy, but they're also cautious.
Okay, we're talking at 5 to 12 on Thursday. Anything could happen, couldn't it? We'll be watching to see what develops. You said recently, though, that Europe should have been more proactive in engaging the Russians before now. What can it do if there is an attempt now to put a deal on the table and force Ukraine into agreeing to it, or at least negotiating on those terms?
In a way, this is about how kind of Europe injects itself into the discussion. I mean, obviously, the sort of crucial things that Europe can do is continue to support Ukraine and spend money, which is not going to be an easy task. European economies are not in the best shape. And at the same time as they're pledging huge amounts of money to rearming their own militaries, huge amounts of money to rebuild their economies so that they can compete with China in the sort of global marketplace of the future, huge amounts of money to keep Ukraine surviving and indeed then in due course rebuild it. And at the same time, are dealing with the rise of populist parties that often question the expenditure priorities. So, I think there is an issue there. But when it comes to actually talking, this issue of proactivity, the point is, at the moment, Europe is, I have to say, a little bit pearl clutching. It says, oh no, Putin, he's a nasty man, he's a war criminal, we can't talk to people like him. And I understand that. But on the other hand, what that means is, in effect, we have made Donald Trump Europe's ambassador to Moscow, which is certainly not a position that I feel very comfortable with. And my view is that Europe needs to actually have a voice, not just simply to respond, because what tends to happen is Donald Trump says something or makes some move that looks as if he's inclining towards Putin's position, and you suddenly get a little fire brigade of European leaders scurrying to the White House to try and talk him down. Sometimes that works, but it won't always work, and it's a very, very reactive way of doing things, and it contributes to Putin's idea that essentially Europe doesn't matter. So instead, I think Europe needs to get some kind of coherent idea of how this war ends. And then not as individual countries, because do it as individual countries and Putin will do what he enjoys doing and play off one against another. But instead, there needs to be some kind of general Europe. And when I say Europe, I don't just simply mean the European Union. UK definitely has to be there. But, some coherent UK outreach to Putin, not because there's anything we want to offer necessarily, but just to try and begin the process of demonstrating to Putin that Europe is still committed to Ukraine and has the unity to continue to support Ukraine practically.
And it's not too late.
Ask me in a year's time. No, I mean, the problem is that precisely we lost a lot of crucial opportunities. And if this peace plan, I mean, whether we can really call it either a piece to do with peace or a plan. But anyway, if this initiative actually really does get pushed through, it is going to be damn hard to make up for lost ground. But the point is, you have to try, because we don't know. This may just be one of these other vaporware proposals that come nowhere. And a year from now, we may well still be talking about the state of the war, God forbid.
Yeah, on the state of the war. You wrote about it in your recent article for the Sunday Times about Pokrovsk, saying it wasn't necessarily a turning point on the battlefield, should it fall. I don't know exactly what the exact situation is today, but we're assuming that it's falling or will fall to the Russian forces, although it hasn't, I don't think, done so quite so yet. You say it's not that turning point, but the start of a new battle in Washington. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that obviously I wrote that before we had the news of this peace deal. And I can't help but wonder if the one connects to the other. Because look, up to this point, again, it's been absolutely clear. Putin doesn't sort of have to worry about Trump favoring Ukraine. Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He cares about getting this war off his desk and dealing with the embarrassment of the continuing rolling of a war that he said he would be able to solve in no time flat. And to this end, he will go for the line of least resistance. And at first, he seemed to think that basically the Russians were winning, so the easiest way of getting this to end was to strong-arm the Ukrainians into accepting some kind of an ugly peace. Then there was a brief period in which actually it seemed that Zelensky, supported by European leaders and also pro-Ukrainian elements within the administration, had actually managed to convince Trump that, in fact, no, it was that the Ukrainians were in a better position. Trump even started talking about the Ukrainians retaking lost territories, which, frankly, everyone thought was pretty much an impossible expectation. But there you go. And so at that point, that's when he launched his sanctions against Russia. Remember, the very first sanctions of his presidency, and even started talking about potentially allowing them to buy Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, that was not really out of love of Kyiv. That was, in a way, him desperately trying to signal to Putin, look, you need to give me something. I need to be able to claim that whatever I present has been, is a genuine deal in which you're making concessions as well as the Ukrainians having to make concessions. I need something to demonstrate that I'm still master of the art of the deal. So I think this is what he was signaling. And Putin, in return, on the one hand, he sent Dmitriev to try and do some negotiations behind the scenes. But at the same time, I think he very much pushed back hard. We saw this with his rhetoric, with the great sort of hoopla around these new nuclear missile weapons, the Burevestnik cruise missile and the Poseidon underwater submarine torpedo. All of this to simply say, look, Russia is too powerful to be strong-armed. And that seems to have done the job of flip-flopping Trump back into thinking, no, actually, if I want the deal, it's easier to side with the Russians and bring pressure to bear on the Ukrainians. Pokrovsk is part of that. I'm sorry for the lengthy preamble, but in that context, Putin also needed to demonstrate that actually the Russians were able to make successes on the ground. And although the nature of this particular scrappy, fragmentary war means it's very hard to say Pokrovsk has fallen, but certainly the military sources I've been talking to in the West, but also in Ukraine, have essentially said that, look, it's a matter of when, not if. In practice, the tipping point has turned. We'll have to wait and see. But the point is, by being able to say, I've taken Pokrovsk, he can basically point to this and say to Trump, you see, the longer this goes on, the further ahead the front line moves.
And that high-ranking Pentagon officials who are in Ukraine at the moment, they are there. Part of their mission is to actually find out what's happening on the battlefield. Do you think the message will get back honestly, clearly, and get through to the White House?
I mean, it is a little surreal that having talked for so long about the information bubble around Putin and the degree to which Putin is a rational actor who nonetheless can make foolish decisions simply because he's surrounded by cronies and yes men and people just tell him what he wants to hear, to then feel, although I'm not quite sure about the rational actor side of things, but nonetheless to actually then be thinking about an American White House, which is suffering from so many of these same pathologies. Are people telling Trump what he needs to know or what he'd like to hear, and how far are they trying to maneuver him? I honestly can't comment on that, simply for the reason that, again, it's a question that I ask contacts within the American system, and no one really understands the information flows around Trump. Bottom line, though, is that Trump wants out, and whether or not people are going to be willing to challenge those assumptions.
And what do you think we can expect on the battlefield in the absence of a cessation of the fighting, though, over the winter months? Because you point to the weather conditions, contrary to previous years, encouraging a more dynamic front line, particularly around Pokrovsk, because of how adversely it affects the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainian drones.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, both sides use drones, but drones are particularly powerful at the moment in the defense. I mean, I think as we've seen, there's two key factors really at play here. One of them is exactly the weather. It's not a determining factor, but it's a sort of a modifying one. The key one, frankly, is manpower and the Ukrainians' troubles in actually being able to recruit enough soldiers, not only to man their front line, but also to allow the rotation of units, so people just simply get a breather and can replenish their stocks of ammunition, new recruits, and just simply morale as much as anything else. Because, we see now that, for example, the bitter struggle around Pokrovsk and successful small-scale counterattacks by the 1st Azov Corps north of Pokrovsk, which actually has taken back a little bit of territory, that was done at the expense of having to draw troops away from the south around Gulyai-Polye, which has allowed the Russians to advance there. So unfortunately, there's this point about, the Ukrainians can't defend on every point. The Russians can choose where to push and where to probe. However, that said, we really have to appreciate the degree to which this is a slow war. The days when there were mechanized forces that could be thrown in to exploit breaches in the enemy line, they're long since gone. We're talking about a war that is largely being fought by handfuls of men on foot, on motorbike, or even in some cases with their supplies on the back of a mule, so that the Russians can grind forward slowly, but they're not in a position where they can make dramatic moves. They're also probably going to have to spend a bit of time sort of reconstituting their forces after Pokrovsk, which was a real meat grinder. So, over the winter, I imagine we can see the Russians continuing to press and take a village here and maybe envelop a town there. but nothing that's going to be a sort of dramatic game changer.
You are just back from Finland, which has a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia. What's the talk in Helsinki about the threat they feel from their neighbour?
It's interesting because obviously, one of the crucial questions was always, are the Russians going to invade us? And my answer was, well, I don't think so. I don't think Putin has any particular desire or incentive to launch an attack against either Finland as a country, which, let's be honest, is both well armed and well secured, but also has a reputation for simple bloody-mindedness. They call it sisu, determination, which the Russians are well aware of, having encountered it in the so-called Winter War, begin just before World War II. But also that there's just very little kind of rationale to that. On the other hand, it is clear that this current campaign of sabotage or probes, as we're now seeing with the Yantar spy ship, off British waters, this kind of constant campaign of provocations and sabotage and destabilization, that will certainly continue. And on this respect, the fact of the matter is, in many ways, the Finns are the poster children for broad spectrum resilience and resistance to them. Everything from having, nuclear and bomb shelters under their cities that can actually, all of Helsinki could be accommodated in their bomb shelters, to the fact that they are very, very well aware of the need for counter disinformation campaigns and the like. So, at the risk of making it sound as if, well, everything is fine in Finland, their big worry was of a nuclear threat or a military threat generally. But the other point I would make is, from Finland's point of view, this is a country that always had a long, complex relationship with Russia. They often talked about having a special relationship with Russia because despite the fact that, they had fought wars, they had also for a long time been an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Tsarist Empire. And certainly ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had traded very, very heavily with the Russians. And so there was still also this element of, okay, at what point will things start to renormalize? Sure, we're not going to be investing in Russia for a long, long time, but trade with Russia, selling them something and just getting paid back straight away, that I think the Finns would be quite happy with. So I think already, even amongst a country that certainly doesn't have any great sympathy or empathy for the Russians in their current imperial war in Ukraine, but nonetheless, even then, I think they're already beginning to think, well, when can we look beyond the end of this war and begin to kind of reconnect on some level?
You mentioned the sabotage operations, and we have the case around UK waters in recent hours and days of the Yantar spy ship sailing close to our waters, shining infrared beams into the eyes of pilots who are trying to keep track of it. And there have also been the incident in Poland where a railway was sabotaged. That's being blamed on Ukrainians accused to have been recruited by the Russians. And then this drone attack on a Turkish-flagged LNG tanker in Ukraine. Do you ever can you join the dots ever in all of this? Or are the individual probing incidents just to find the weak spots in NATO?
Well, in some ways, that is how you join the dots. Let's put aside that Turkish tanker. As far as the Russians are concerned, if it's in a Ukrainian port loading Ukrainian materials, then it's a legitimate target. But if we think of the sort of the sabotage and the probing and so forth, look, on the one level, the Yantar's activities are quite normal. That's what it's for. It's for essentially mapping all these subterranean cables and pipelines, and if need be in time of war, doing something about it. But the fact that it's actually doing so close to British territorial waters, the fact that it's using these beams to then sort of try and warn off and harm the RAF pilots, that's clearly more of a direct provocation. I think at the moment what we're seeing is what seem to be a very sort of scattered array of individual attacks, most of which burning down a shopping mall here or, damaging power lines of a train there, might seem to be trivial. And on one level they are. They're not the sort of thing that's going to bring down a state or anything like that. I think it's part of the Russians building up almost like a sort of a blueprint for how they can launch a more sustained campaign. They're still having to work through the use of proxies, again, locals, often who are hired, as we saw with the Leighton arson attacks, a bunch of local no-hopers who are hired for a relatively small amount of money to carry out their attacks, which creates its own constraints. And what we tend to see are pulses of activity followed by relative lulls. And it's not connected to the state of peace talks or anything like that. So I think this is almost that they try a few things and then they stop and say, okay, what are the lessons learned? Which attacks work, which attacks don't? How could we have done this one better? And then they have another pulse of operations. Now, that to me implies, and this is no more than my own supposition, that precisely they are kind of working out a blueprint, which means that if they choose to, they can operate a much more coherent, sophisticated, and dangerous campaign.
What do you think the best response is then to disrupt that blueprint?
Look, I think in many ways, one of the best ways of thinking about this is how the West has in the past dealt very effectively with terrorism. Whether we're talking about Europe handling the various kind of red terrorist movements in the late 70s and the 80s, or indeed Britain dealing with the IRA and similar movements from Northern Ireland. In that, obviously, you try to disrupt them in as many ways as possible. You place your agents within the cells, you try and monitor their communications, etc. But at the same time, you have to be aware that there are attacks that are going to get through, no matter how good your security apparatus. And you just simply have to say, well, these attacks are going to get through, and we will deal with them as best as possible. But the main thing is we will not allow that to change our policy. I mean, it may seem banal to be saying that keep calm and carry on is one of the best ways of responding. But the point is the Russians will only launch these attacks, which have their costs, political costs in terms of money and whatever else, if they think they will work, if they think they will have an effect. If what they see is that it gets us annoyed, but in the main we shrug and carry on, well, then this is what is in deterrence theory, deterrence by denial, by saying, look, don't bother launching these attacks, because it won't change anything.
Because I was wondering when I heard the British Defence Secretary speaking in response to the Yantar's closeness to our waters, saying, come any closer, we're ready. And I was kind of thinking, ready to do what exactly? And I was wondering what the Russian response would be to that kind of remark.
Well, I mean, I can tell you certainly that the public Russian response is fairly derisory, because quite like, exactly, look, our problem is this. Some people say, oh, we should fight fire with fire. We should do to the Russians what they're doing to us. The trouble is that we're meant to be the good guys. We are meant to operate according to international law. And in any case, Russia is in some way, I would say, a much tougher target for us to operate in. I mean, the Ukrainians are able to do so because the Ukrainians, in a way, as far as they're concerned, anything goes. But we're not actually, I think, at the moment, in a position to do that. And secondly, we have a tendency precisely to, because we are democratic political societies, have politicians who will rely very heavily on dramatic rhetoric that the Russians can often see through. The Russians are very good at identifying our genuine red lines so that they know exactly how far they can go. If the Yantar steamed into British territorial waters, I mean, actually directly attacking it would be the last response. But the point is, it could be boarded or otherwise. So the Russians, I would suggest, famous last words, but are very, very unlikely to do that. They pick and they provoke, but they're very, very careful to try and keep things below the threshold at which even Western societies would respond.
On the politics then, Mark, any news on Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister?
I mean, yes, there's a lot of speculation about the fact that, he's out of favour because he botched his conversation with Marco Rubio, and as a result, the proposed Budapest summit between Trump and Putin disappeared. I suspect it's something as basic as the fact that he's ill. I mean, first of all, Lavrov does not freelance. Increasingly these days, he's little more than, frankly, Putin's dictaphone, sent out to go and repeat whatever implausible message he's expected to do so. On the other hand, he, like so many of the Russian leadership, is in his 70s. And the interesting thing is, we never hear about any of them being ill. Now, unless it's the healthiest collection of 70-year-olds you've ever come across, it's clear that some will be ill from time to time. I suspect this is something that the Russian press is told not to report because it would draw attention to the potential health issues of a certain 73-year-old Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So, I mean, I think it's just that he's out of circulation because he's ill or whatever, and maybe staying out of circulation precisely because of the Western media feeding frenzy. Because they love creating, this is dramaturgia, sort of dramatic stories that distract us away from the important stuff. Because while we're saying, where's Lavrov? we've got the Americans coming up with some peace plan over Ukraine. So, look, I think given that Lavrov is a man who's been trying to retire since 2014.
Should we stop talking about him then?
Yeah, exactly. Look, if Putin really wants to punish him, given that Lavrov is desperate to retire, he would keep Lavrov in place. So we'll just have to wait and see.
I mentioned earlier, or we mentioned earlier, the corruption investigation that's going on at the moment in Ukraine into this alleged siphoning off of money from the state energy sector. An ally close to Zelensky managed to get out of the country before the police came knocking on his door, before he could be arrested, and two ministers resigned. I mean, how has that scandal gone down in Moscow?
Well, obviously, they're delighted by it because, firstly, it speaks to their own narrative about, this corrupt neo-Nazi cabal who's running Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. Secondly, they're very happy because they can frame this, especially to their own audiences, as signs that the West, and above all the United States, is tiring of Zelensky. Because after all, to go into the sort of detailed politics, you have agencies like the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, which are very much close to the presidential administration. Whereas NABU and SAPO, the independent anti-corruption agencies which have launched this investigation and publicized it, are indeed that. They are independent. Now, the Moscow line is that quote-unquote independence actually means that they are controlled by Europe or controlled by the United States. So they are framing this as America giving Zelensky a signal to basically not mess around. And, it's tightening the leash and so forth. So they're using this as an opportunity to not only lambast Ukraine again, but also to try and reassure Russians that, we said this war might well be over. Well, here is a sign that it really might well soon be over.
Interesting. So your book that I mentioned in the opener, you've updated it. We need to talk about Putin is the title of it. What do we need to know about Putin? You're saying that he is more Putin than ever since you wrote the book. In the context of the Ukraine war, what does that mean?
Well, it's particularly interesting because, look, I have framed Putin as this essentially quite risk-averse figure for all his kind of macho PR. And then in February 2022, he seemed to make an incredibly bold and indeed foolhardy move when he invaded Ukraine. And at first I was thinking, oh my gosh, did I get it wrong? Well, you'll never get an academic to admit surely that they got it wrong. And lo and behold, over time, as it became clearer why he had made that move, I think it became clear that actually it wasn't that he thought he was doing anything daring. He was genuinely convinced that this was going to be an easy operation. And a few weeks or months later, Russian forces would be pulled out, leaving a proxy government in place. And what we've seen in really, even before, but certainly especially in the years since the invasion, is, as I say, Putin being still demonstrably the Putin of, say, 2017 when I wrote the book. But many of his more problematic characteristics become even more evident. That he is even more disconnected from his own country and from his own elite and cocooned by, as I said, cronies and yes men. Even more convinced that he has enemies around him, and especially that the West is hell-bent on undermining him, his regime, and indeed his country. And it's that insecurity, which has always been, frankly, I think, at the heart of understanding Putin. This is a man who has constantly felt that he's at threat. And his own lesson that he learned running with street gangs in Leningrad as a kid was if you know you're going to get into a fight, you throw the first punch. That's often explained his aggressive actions. It's actually fear. Well, that has become more evident, including fear of his own people. This is the funny thing. There is this notion of Russians that they're somehow a rather sort of sheep-like people who like to be ordered around. Actually, Russia's history is of riot and rebellion, of terrorism and turmoil. And Russia's regimes have so often been so brutal precisely because they feared their own people. And I think that's increasingly clear also of Putin as his regime increasingly becomes authoritarian and really little more than a police state. So I think this is what I mean about, certain characteristics we saw have now just become all the more important.
And that amplification of those characteristics, how do you think that will change his attitude? Will it just make him double down on his attitude to the war in Ukraine, how it should end, or that it should not end?
Well, remember that Putin's priority is survival. His survival, that of his circle of clients and cronies, and the survival of his regime and the survival of his country, pretty much in that order. And I think in that respect, from the point of view of the war, he didn't expect to get involved in a major war. Now he needs something that he can demonstrate will be to the Russian people, oh, this is a triumph. And I think this helps explain why he's, for example, demanding this remaining portion of Donetsk, so that he can say, and we've got, despite all the serried ranks of NATO backing their Ukrainian proxies, we got this. So it's not that I think he is absolutely committed to fighting the war until Russian tanks roll into Kyiv or anything like that. That's not going to happen. He knows that. He is pragmatic enough to realize that. But on the other hand, it certainly helps explain why he's being so intransigent, because he needs this to be a triumph. Because otherwise, I think he fears that he gets flanked by both an unhappy elite who didn't want the war in the first place, and the ultranationalists, who essentially are saying you should have gone even harder on this.
Just interested, finally, Mark, to get your thoughts on what will be spiking your interest in the coming months when you look at developments and you look at Russia and you look at the Kremlin. What are you looking for?
I mean, I think what we're seeing is the economy sliding into recession, but as it were, sliding quite slowly and gently into recession. We got inflation at 6.5%, which is serious, but it's not sort of Weimar Germany hyperinflation or anything like that. We have growing tensions within the industrial sector that is not directly connected to defense and so forth. We have a budget that is under pressure. So, there is nothing that currently says imminent crisis. However, this is a regime that I think is increasingly brittle. Its capacity to respond to the unexpected, which in the past depended on complete control of the security apparatus, Putin's own legitimacy, and its capacity to throw virtually unlimited amounts of money at crises. All three of those are now severely constrained. And so in some ways, I will be precisely looking for signs of something. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say signs of the unexpected, but precisely those indications that something other than the ordinary is happening. So, for example, periods in which Putin is unexpectedly out of sight, which might suggest that he is ill, or unusual concatenations of sackings of not just rear area generals whom we knew were deeply corrupt, but frontline officers who actually seem to be successful, because that might suggest that they are grumbling or even conspiring behind the scenes. Unexpected churn in the upper levels of the leadership, particularly in the security apparatus, because all the leaders of the security agencies are frankly getting older. Most of them are more than 70 years old. So I think, again, it's those signs of something subterranean, because on the surface things are, I'm not saying great, but they are certainly bearable and dealable with for quite a while. But it's anything that suggests, there is a crisis that they're trying to keep quiet, and probably that crisis is going to become much more significant than it would have 5 years ago.
Mark, great to talk to you. Come and talk to us again if you see any signs of that happening. Really good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.